Why the West is ignorant about Africa. Early missionaries, explorers and colonialists who arrived in Africa had a constant close-up view of how indigenous African people responded innately to their environment. This easily gave them a deep and profound grasp of the nature of African people's thinking and understanding. Whether or not they realized it, African people, like people everywhere, wanted and want power. That is, power to do things like eat, marry, travel, look nice, impress people, be healthy, and so on. Outsiders, soon perceived as having much that was desirable, became the object of imitation. Conversion to Christianity was an outcome of imitation before the value of the gospel was even realized. We could say that doing what Christians do preceded people realizing the love of God for themselves. For many African people, the gospel of Jesus was part of a package. It came with all sorts of things like the English language, wearing clothes, having one public wife, knowledge of sums, building square rather than round houses, basic education, and so on. Getting crowds seeking to benefit from these things was not difficult. African people's behaviours changed along with their environment. From responding to, let's say, bushy conditions, wild animals, ancestral taboos, and aggressive neighbours, they oriented themselves more to a determined imitation of their prosperous visitors. They transformed themselves from their proud, independent ways of life to doing all they could to supplement their own power by imitation. Understanding differences between indigenous people and outsiders became much more difficult when locals hid who they really are in favour of imitation in the interests of power. This can be illustrated. Let's imagine explorers and the first missionaries arrived in an African community in 1900. They found something like this. They found a people who were behaving according to ways of imitating each other. Their being closely related resulted in their way of life faithfully reflecting their values and beliefs. As time went by, their desire for power and other reasons had those people move more towards imitation of their visitors. This was a situation in perhaps, let's say, 1950. The expansion of formal education using English and many related factors, recently smartphones, have increased the apparent degree to which many indigenous African people imitate others from outside, especially those in the West. This made it much more difficult to know people as they are. Early missionaries had little choice but to learn indigenous languages in order to engage closely with people. This enabled them to learn an enormous amount about local ways of life. Initially, because they did not know what aspects of their life might be considered wrong, local people were very open to sharing honestly about themselves. As time went by, they hid more and more, such as their extra wives, their fear of witches, even the fact that they were imitating. As a result, as time went by, it became more and more difficult for outsiders to understand local people, especially when locals started talking to visitors in their own language of English. More and more of local reality came to be concealed. This is how outsiders to Africa, we're thinking particularly about Westerners, have become more and more ignorant about Africa. We can illustrate this diagrammatically. The line on the left represents the truth about Africa. The line on the right represents the truth about the West. In 1900, it was very easy for Western people to move very close to African truth. By 1950, this had become more difficult. By, say, 1980, when more missionaries were doing ministry entirely using English, understanding fell even further. In 2020, many Western people who are very influential in Africa engage entirely using European languages. Many do not even travel to the continent, preferring to communicate via the internet. The final diagram represents what is supposed to be happening. That is, that there is these days no need for Westerners to learn African languages. That African people are adopting more and more of Western ways of life. That the cultural, intellectual, behavioural, linguistic and every other gap is falling quickly approaching zero. This is the secular dream of how things should be. The problem perhaps is that this has not been happening. There's less and less ways now actually of knowing whether it's been happening or not. If all our eggs are in the basket of this happening, we may be in trouble.